IDC Radio.
בינתחומי.
106.2 FM.
הרדיו הבינתחומי.
IDC Radio. In collaboration with כל ישראל.
106.2 FM.
IDC International Radio, 106.2 FM, from Israel to the world.
Counter-Terrorism Today.
Hello and good day to all of our listeners and viewers. If you are listening on the radio or podcasts on the internet, on the ICT websites, on our YouTube page, on our Facebook page, or if you are watching us on our Facebook page or YouTube page, thank you for joining us. We have a very special episode this week for you on counterterrorism today. In studio with me, we have Dr. Ely Karmon. He's a senior research scholar at the International Institute for Counterterrorism. He's a senior research fellow at the Institute for Policy and Strategy here at the IDC, and he lectures on international terrorism, CBRN terrorism at the MA courses in the counterterrorism school here at the IDC. Dr. Ely Karmon, how are you doing today?
Hello, Etai. Glad to be here again.
Thank you very much for taking the time and joining us. We have a lot to talk about and a lot to touch on. But before we do, I wanted to set the stage for everything that we are going to speak about in the coming minutes here. And as we look at you personally, professionally, you travel around the world and you give lectures all over the globe. Recently, there was the IISC conference, and you presented a very interesting paper there, as well as your PowerPoint presentation that I've had the privilege of viewing and seeing. Quite impressive. But one note to take from it, and I hope you could potentially elaborate a little bit for us on it, is one of the main notes that was said about your presentation is that you stated that it's still very favorable factors for a possible resurgence of the Islamic State. In essence, really, that the same factors that were there when the Islamic State rose are still there today. Could you elaborate a little bit on that, especially when you hear President Trump and other world leaders claiming that ISIS has been defeated?
Yes, indeed, ISIS has been defeated on the ground. They don't have any territory, almost don't have a territory in Syria and Iraq. They're even fighting with the old al-Nusra in Idlib region. But the issue of jihadist ideology and support of young people in the Middle East, but also in the Western world, still exists. And we also must remember that the infrastructure which sent the thousands and thousands of foreign fighters, first to Syria and then to Iraq, but mainly to Syria, where Al-Qaeda was an Al-Qaeda infrastructure. And only after the formation of the Islamic State in July 2014, people began to flock also to Iraq, to the Caliphate. So now there is a fight, by the way, ideological fight, and this even a practical fight between Al-Qaeda, which has very deep roots in the West, especially if we speak about specifically Europe, and ISIS, which had support, but now is in a very difficult position. And I think that, as I explained also to my listeners, if you want, at the very highest level in Hungary and Bulgaria, that we have a window of opportunity of 2-3 years using this period when they are very weak after relocating to Afghanistan, some to Libya, but actually they still are weak to prepare the counter-terrorism infrastructure, if we speak specifically about Europe, but also, for instance, Australia, Central Asia, and order to, on the one hand, on the issue of narrative and the issue of preventing radicalization, to find new tools, but also on the very operative steps that we should take in order to impede, to stop any possible kind of reburn of ISIS like it happened in 2013, 2014.
What type of steps do you think that the international community, or better yet, the Europeans is who you were speaking to, what type of infrastructure do they need to set up to counter those measures, exactly as you were saying?
First of all, we need a lot of resources. I mean, the law enforcement, the intelligence services, and even if you want the social infrastructure, needs a lot of resources, because we saw that even after the big attacks in Belgium and France in 2015-16, the new recruits in the law enforcement forces are not sufficient. Because if we spoke of 3,000-4,000 potential jihadist terrorists in France and Great Britain, now we hear that there are 25,000 in Great Britain and 40,000 in France. So the people which deal with this threat have to have more personnel and more technological resources, modern technological resources, to monitor huge amount of potential future terrorists. And also, by the way, the issue of many which were imprisoned but begin to be now liberated from the prison. In the UK, 80% person at the end of last year, including the main ideologue in Great Britain, Chuderi, and also in France, we speak to this year of 80, 90 people to be liberated from 500 arrested people. And also, I think the cooperation and also the standardization of the measures on the operational level, but also on juridical level, should be more deep and more wider. Because we saw, even in the case, for instance, in Spain, in Barcelona attacks, that there was not a good cooperation between the Madrid central forces and the Catalonian forces which dealt with the attacks.
Yeah, those are very interesting points you make, and what are very needed financial resources for law enforcement to help deal with the stem of, or the tide of all of these foreign fighters and jihadists flowing into Europe. A lot of them are former citizens or citizens of these countries, so it has become a very hot topic of debate. You made mention that ISIS is still trying to fight a little bit in Idlib province versus the Nusra Front. And Idlib province is a very interesting subject matter right now, as the Russians are heavily bombing the area in coordination with the Turks. Maybe you can explain to us a little bit about that relationship and what's going on exactly in the Idlib province right now.
Idlib is the last pocket of jihadists, but also sometimes moderate forces from the Syrian opposition. In a population of 2 million, there are some 20,000-30,000 fighters. And they don't want to renounce and to leave their weapons and act according to the Turkish-Russian deal, which stipulated that in October 2018, the Turks will arrange some kind of retreat of these forces from the Idlib province, and they will have some control in this area, while clearly the Damascus regime and the Russians also are opposed to this failed deal, especially the last weeks. And we saw even the Sochi last meeting between Erdogan, President Putin, and President Rouhani of Iran did not give good results. So it is not clear how this will develop, and if we will have a new hot war, if you want, not only small bombardments, but more fighting, which will produce, by the way, a huge new wave of refugees. And this also depends on the American standing. And after President Trump decided to withdraw completely and very quickly from Syria, we saw a change in the sense that for the moment, at least 400 soldiers or troops will be left in northern and southern Syria in order probably to challenge at least the Russian and Damascus strategy on the one hand, and also to perhaps to help stop the Iranian penetration through northern Syria. And there is also the Kurdish problems. We don't have time perhaps to enter, but still we are in a period of standby. We don't know exactly how it will develop because all these forces are not yet decided. For instance, the Turks threaten to enter the Kurdish area. It is not clear if they will do it without Russian or American air cover, and what the Kurds will decide, perhaps to go and make a deal with the government in Damascus.
And when you look at the Turkish decision to potentially incur into Syria against the Kurdish people, the people they feel are terrorists, people they feel are enemies of Turkey, what do you think is preventing Erdogan from going in right now? Because he's quite a brazen man, and when he wants to do something, he seems to just do it.
Yeah, but still he depends, as I said, from the two big powers. United States, which is a kind of ally, but not exactly a lie, and President Trump promised him to give him a free hand, but then he leaves the troops there, and he wants that the Kurds be ensured not to be hurt by the buffer zone that Erdogan is trying to build there. In my opinion, he will not make a new military incursion as long as the Americans stop it, at least verbally, and also the Russians practically do the same. He needs, by the way, in order to succeed on the ground, he needs air support from his own air force, but he cannot use them as long Russia and the United States do not permit it.
As just for clarification, the Russians and Americans are controlling the airspace?
Practically the Russians are controlling, but as long as there are American troops, especially northeastern Syria, and they are supported by quite a strong Kurdish force, the SDF. I don't see the Turkish. First of all, not the Russian enter the American zone, and also the Turks being, in a way, they are deterred from this presence. And they try to coordinate with the Pentagon and the White House. For the moment, there is no real solution for the quagmire.
I think it's a perfect segue into the rest of the Syrian scenario, or quagmire, as you aptly stated. When thinking about the entire situation and saying how the Turks want to enter and they want to get rid of their enemy, who are the Kurds inside Turkey, they are going to need air support. They have quite the air force, but knowing that the Russians are controlling the airspace in the area makes it difficult for them, and they don't want to get into a hot war with the Russians, especially not fighter jets in a dogfight in the air. But something that is really interesting, how would Erdogan and the Turkish government feel knowing that Israel just goes in and violates the Syrian airspace with the Russians in control of the airspace, and Israel hits Iran, their enemy, and Hezbollah, their enemy, inside Syria? And the IDF also just revealed that Hezbollah has set up a new entrenchment inside Syria that you can almost bet on that will be eventually exposed in another way militarily by the Israeli Air Force. But when you look at it, how does Erdogan feel? Why is it okay that Netanyahu sends his Air Force in and challenges Russian superiority in the sky, but he's afraid to?
I think, first of all, his deal with the Russians is a failure. Erdogan or Turkey did not deliver the goods. They didn't succeed to withdraw the jihadists and even the pro-Turkish forces there, because the Tahrir al-Sham, which is the former or the new, if not the new kind of Al-Qaeda faction there, they almost destroyed the Turkish pro-Turkish troops, and then they control Idlib. So he cannot say to the Russians and to Damascus, okay, I delivered the goods, let's now continue to talk. In the case of Israel, there is an agreement with the Russians, but there the Russians did not deliver the goods, in the sense that they promised that in southern Syria will not see any Iranian and clearly not Hezbollah or Shia, pro-Iranian Shia troops. And still we see that they are there. And there was, by the way, information several months already ago that Shia militias or even Hezbollah and even Iranians are using Syrian army uniforms in order to embed themselves in the in the region. So I think Israel in this case, perhaps Erdogan is jealous, I would say. But Israel has its own problems in order to continue to deter the Iranians and to stop their implantation, physical territorial implantation in Syria.
Iran bothers or tries to bother Israel on many fronts, not just the Syrian front. We know that they are a supporter of terrorist groups inside the Gaza Strip who continuously provoke Israel in many different ways, be it the Islamic Jihad, which is very close to the Iranian regime, or Hamas, who has a hot and cold relationship with the Iranian regime. One day when it's to the Iranians' advantage, they're very close to Hamas. On another day, they shut Hamas completely out. That happened the last time when Hamas refused to support Assad inside Syria during the civil war there, and Assad and the Iranians pretty much cut contact with them. But that wasn't the end of Hamas. They moved over and were very cozy inside Turkey, friends with President Erdogan. And just recently, as the Great March of Return, as Hamas calls it, on the Israeli border, weekly protests, if you will, with weapons on the Israeli border continue. We saw a rocket fly into Israel this week. We saw an Israeli retaliation. Everything seemed to calm down for the moment, but there is more upheaval. I guess you could look at it on a global standpoint because of the international community's involvement. King Abdullah currently is flying to Washington to speak about this situation, and that situation is the uproar of what's happening on Temple Mount. This is a very near and dear cause to the Palestinians. Hamas uses it always as a provocation. So what do we see going on right now between the Great March of Return on the Israeli borders with Gaza, the provocations on Temple Mount, and the international community, specifically Erdogan, the Jordanians, getting heavily involved right now?
Okay, indeed, the Iranians are involved in the Palestinian arena, even in the West Bank, but mainly in the Gaza Strip. And their main proxy is not Hamas, but the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. But I would like to relate, first of all, to the Israeli strategy, on the Israeli policy, because I think the roots of the present situation are in great part the result of in my opinion, failed or erroneous Israeli strategy vis-à-vis Gaza. We are now exactly 1 year since this new strategy used by Hamas. First using kites, and then balloons, and then small weapons fire, and then explosives on the fence. And more provocations with balloons, which have not only trying to burn the fields, but also to use explosives, which
they've attached IEDs.
Yes. So this is the problem of the Israeli government's policy. Since the beginning, Israel was not decided, or the Israeli government, how to deal with the physical activity or the terrorist activity, and try to reach an understanding with the Hamas, mainly through the good relations with Egypt and, in a way, also Qatar. Egypt being the mediator, a direct mediator with Hamas, and Qatar giving the financial support. But we saw that this strategy is not working. It's not working, especially when several months ago there were 500 missiles fired at our territory, when we see tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people in southern Israel, especially near the Gaza Strip, suffering from this every night activity and every Friday. And the decision was to continue these attempts, entering now in a very sensitive period before the elections. So clearly this puts much more pressure on the government to take the necessary steps to stop the aggressiveness of the Hamas, because finally Hamas is in a very weak position. They are cut from the Sinai. They are cut by the Egyptian army from their supplies of missiles, and cut from the sea by the Israeli Navy. And the only thing that they have is the Qatari money which permits them, with Israeli acceptance, to have a bit more electricity, better water, but this is only temporary and it is not sufficient. Hamas now, after such long period, when they saw that they can challenge Israel and the Israeli army, they entered a period when they can raise the price of their agreement for an understanding because of the elections. And they know that it will be very difficult for the government to take serious steps, military steps, in order to stop the Hamas aggressiveness. In this enters, indeed, the Iranian provocation. When Hamas tries to restrain itself, then they use the Palestinian Islamic Jihad for provocations. And it seems that this relatively small organization is now much more independent and less listening to the Hamas advisors or Hamas policy. And this reflects itself also in the West Bank, because Hamas, knowing that it is limited in its military activity from Gaza Strip, is trying to make the situation more challenging for Israel in the West Bank, even attacking against the interest of the Palestinian Authority. We know that many suicide attempts or serious terrorist attempts have been stopped by our security and intelligence and military. And therefore, the issue of the Temple Mount, for instance, also again, because of the elections, has become a very hot and sensitive subject, when it is not only the Palestinians that we have to take in account, but also the Jordanians, which have their own internal problems, their own pressures by the opposition in the parliament, by the Muslim Brotherhood in Jordan, and the weak standing, perhaps, of the King Abdallah vis-à-vis these forces. We spoke about Turkey, by the way. We see again Erdogan, after a relatively long period of time that he did not threaten or did not attack or criticize Israel. Lately, he criticized personally Prime Minister Netanyahu on the issue of the Temple Mount, because Turkey, on the one hand, supports the Hamas for many years, and also now tries to have a special task or role in Jerusalem. Since, by the way, 2 years ago, when there were a lot of troubles on the Temple Mount, and this in order to convince its own constituency before the March 31 local elections that he is the guy which defends the interests of the Muslims worldwide, and he is the leader of the if you want, the Muslim world, the leader of the Palestinian issue. And by the way, lately they attacked even China on the issue of the oppression of Uyghurs in China. Again, in my opinion, because of the elections, because he knows that he depends very much on Chinese economic relations. And the Chinese, by the way, responded quite quickly by closing their consulate in Izmir.
That's very interesting. And as we continue to look at Erdogan as trying to be the leader of the Muslim world, as you just mentioned, I have to ask then, how does Saudi Arabia feel about the rise of Erdogan and his, I guess, standing and provocations and trying to realize the dream that he is the leader of the Muslim world, when we see Saudi Arabia also views itself as a leader of the Muslim world, specifically because it's the protectorate of Mecca and Medina. Iran wants to be the leader of the Muslim world, specifically on the Shiite cause. So we know that Turkey and Iran are cozying up to one another, but where does Saudi Arabia sit in the middle of all that?
That's exactly the problem of the Sunni world, that there is no unity of strategy and policy vis-à-vis the Iranian Shia threat. And Turkey, or personally Erdogan, has taken a very anti-Saudi position. We all remember the Khashoggi assassination incident in Istanbul. Here, Erdogan played a very, I would say, nasty role, trying to win, on the one hand, the American administration, also American public, and the international community in trying to weaken the position of Mohammed bin Salman, which is the actual leader of Saudi Arabia, and therefore supporting Qatar, including sending military forces to Qatar. And now, as we see, in trying to subvert Saudi influence in Jerusalem, if there is one. And for instance, we see it on the issue of the financial support to the Hamas. There is an understanding between Israel and Egypt that there must be some fruits, economic fruits to Hamas in order to stabilize the situation. But for the moment, the only ones which are ready to give the money for it until perhaps several months from now, not more than that, is Qatar, which is one of the supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood. And therefore, the Saudis, which would be, from the point of view of Egypt and Israel, the best supporters of this policy in Gaza, don't want to be involved because they see Hamas as a Muslim Brotherhood faction which is opposed to the interest, ideological but also strategic, of Saudi Arabia.
And in your opinion, would you say Hamas follows closely to a Muslim Brotherhood ideology?
They have a problem with Egypt in this sense, and they have already distanced themselves from the jihadist ISIS faction or Sinai province because they understood otherwise the Egyptians will strangle the Gaza Strip. But they are still a Muslim Brotherhood organization, very active. The only ones, by the way, besides Turkey, which control the territory, and they have excellent relations with Turkey, although Turkey cannot support them as much as the Qataris financially. They do it politically. We see it vis-à-vis Israel, but also on the international arena. And these are the only support they have. Turkey and Iran, but Iran is far away, and Iran is in conflict itself with most of the Sunni world, and clearly with Israel and the United States.
Qatar, a very small nation, very powerful economically, one of the world's largest reserves of natural gas. They also have an oil industry, a strong economy, and only about 2 million citizens. So then the question really becomes, what is Qatar's goal here in giving cash to Hamas, in giving cash to the Gaza Strip? And as you said, it's only going to last for another few more months. And thinking about it, it almost feels like this is a waste of money. Literally, they're handing money over to Hamas. Qatar really isn't seeing much benefit by handing over this money. It's not warming relations with Saudi Arabia as they could possibly want.
The contrary.
Exactly. It's not. Israel isn't necessarily happy about Qatar wanting to fund Hamas. So what are Qatar's goals here, knowing that they're a strong ally of the United States at the end of the day, just as Saudi Arabia is? So when you think about it, what is Qatar gaining by this?
From the point of view of Qatar, the money given to Hamas is really small money.
Pocket change.
Nothing really serious. But politically, they show that they are involved in a very sensitive issue for the Arab and Muslim world, the Palestinian issue. They support the Palestinians to improve their economic and social situation. And also as a kind of challenge, especially to the Saudis. And by the way, I think they are coordinating in a way or another with the Turks, because the Turks, as I said, are directly involved in support and even in defense of the Qatari independence. Now, it's very strange because Qatar called it at the time when they were very much involved in financing jihadist and Islamist group in Syria, jockey. In all this regional game and the global game, they are a jockey which every time changes the rule of the game in their favor. But basically, I think they are supportive of the Muslim Brotherhood, and we see it when the only ones in the Gulf supporting and even giving asylum to the Muslim Brotherhood, and also coordinating with Turkey, which is the Muslim Brotherhood power, if you want, although not exactly Egyptian kind of, but AKP is a brother party of the Muslim Brotherhood. So they accept the presence of the huge American bases, and this is actually the insurance they have that they will not be attacked by the Saudis and the Emirates, okay? And this gives them also the possibility to play some kind of game between the Gulf states and Iran, which, by the way, lately has much better relations with Qatar on the background of the crisis with the other Gulf countries.
Before we let you go, Dr. Karmon, one last question for you, and it really encompasses the whole region as a whole. As we know, we're about 3.5 weeks away from Israeli elections, where we may see a turnover of government, we may see a renewal of government. No one is too sure yet, but one thing is for sure is that on April 9th, the Israelis go to the polls to elect a new government. During that time, one of two options can happen. You can see the enemies of Israel try to take advantage and attack Israel, which could have the effect of galvanizing the people behind the current government, and they might have to react. Or the current government might not be able to react as they are hamstrung and tied up because they're going to elections and during a provocation. But at the same time, the enemies of Israel might say this isn't the right time because we don't want to give the government of Israel an opportunity to show its might and its force, and might use disproportionate force because of coming elections. And as we look around us, Iran, as mentioned, has a foothold in Gaza, be it the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, be it Hamas. We know that they have a foothold in southern Syria with their own personnel building bases and entrenching, as well as their proxy Hezbollah. And at any moment that they want, they can call for a rain of rockets on Israel from the north and from the south. As we look towards the elections, what are your predictions on the enemies of Israel? Are they going to provoke Israel in the next few weeks due to the coming elections, or is things going to stay relatively quiet?
In my evaluation, nobody will try to challenge really militarily directly Israel. There could be some provocation. And by the way, one of the main tasks of our intelligence is to foil this kind of surprise attacks, if you want, either by bombers, suicide bombers, or missiles, and so on. The threat is mainly from the south, where the situation is very unstable, and Hamas could make a wrong decision, or Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and provoke the Israeli government in a retaliation. But I think that this government will not retaliate, will make everything possible not to retaliate. And this will be probably the main task of the next government on the security issues. I think that the present government has been quite successful in its Syrian policy, although the agreements with the Russians, as I said, are not exactly followed by all the players. But the main situation of crisis is in the south vis-à-vis Hamas, and I think there is time to change the strategy, to challenge militarily Hamas, and to try to destroy its military clasp on the Gaza Strip and permit return of the Palestinian Authority, which, by the way, is very much involved in fighting Hamas. Abu Mazen personally, with support of the Egyptians, which also, I think, are interested in doing it. And finally, achieving a situation where not in the hands of the decision of one of the leaders of Hamas, or the hands of a lone terrorist attack which can provoke military war in the Gaza Strip.
Dr. Ely Karmon, Senior Research Scholar at the International Institute for Counter-Terrorism, a Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for Policy and Strategy here at the IDC. He lectures on international terrorism and CBRN terrorism at the MA Counter-Terrorism Studies here at the IDC. Dr. Karmon, can you just let our listeners know, because one of the greatest features of a Dr. Karmon interview is that we get to let everybody know about the latest articles and presentations that you've been giving. Can you let everyone know where we can go find one of your latest articles?
I put on my Facebook page, but also I think the ICT put my latest presentation at a very close conference with the Minister of Interior of Hungary, but in the framework of my activity for a Bulgarian think tank, as you said, IISSC. and there is also explanation, a text about this PowerPoint presentation. And now I am working on two new subjects. One is exactly the crisis between Turkey and China on the issue of the Uyghur problem in China, but also in a way a kind of competition with Saudi Arabia, because lately MBS has been visiting China, and he has very good relations with the government in China. Although, as Erdogan accused the Chinese, they are oppressing the Uyghurs. And in the end, I hope to work also in a very basic research, the relationship between Iran and the Muslim Brotherhood. Historical relations, and how in these present times they are cooperating, or if they can cooperate and advance their mutual interests.
That would be fascinating, specifically since they both come from very, very different backgrounds, and how they would ever come together would be truly amazing and truly interesting to research and understand about, because that could have deep ramifications for healing of the rifts in the Muslim world as a whole between Shiite and Sunni. As mentioned, you can go visit Dr. Karmon's reports at the ICT website. You can check it out on his Facebook page, his LinkedIn page. And the latest event that he was at is the International Institute for Security and Cooperation. Dr. Karmon's presentation is on their website. You can go to www.inisc.eu and look up for their conference, and you can find Dr. Karmon's presentation there as well. Dr. Karmon, thank you so much for taking the time and joining us here in studio.
Thank you for giving me this platform.
Appreciate it. Have a wonderful day.
Bye-bye. Shabbat Shalom.
Counter-Terrorism Today.